One idea that I took from Hans-Georg Gadamer, which I still believe is valid today, is the prejudice against prejudice. He made me look at things differently by pointing out that the way we navigate through life cannot be possibly from a starting point which is absolutely free from prejudice. This itself would not be a livable position, and it would not be a human position. And contrary to what we often believe, it wouldn't even be an intelligent position, but it would be an absolutely stupid position to take. Stupid in the sense that it would be not perceptible, it would not be capable of perceiving reality and dealing with reality at all. Now, the idea of fighting prejudice is oftentimes displayed as one of the core features of modernity. You don't just take over what your parent generation did and what your parent generation believed, but whenever you're told to do something in a specific way, you ask the question why, and you're asking for justifications. So you never take up beliefs no matter what and just believe in them as well, but you always have to probe them and always have to question them. And Descartes had a nice picture for that. He had made the realization that many of the beliefs that he held as a younger person turned out to be wrong. And this led him into the path of questioning his general ability to know reality and emphasizing the importance of questioning everything that is given by his parent generation or by his own tradition. And the picture that he used was that he had to tear down the entire edifice. He had to tear down the entire castle or house he was living in and build a new one on solid ground and on solid foundations. Now, Gadamer also made the point that even in Descartes doesn't do this while he is living outside in the woods. So Descartes, even in his picture, had something like a provisionary home, a small building, which consists of some of the core beliefs, the core tenets that he was holding. And Descartes, I think, described those as being some of the core insights that he has taken from people he values, from traditions that he values and he believes to be immediately evident, and he's very thankful for some of the core aspects which are still there and form a provisionary home while he's building his new home. So even Descartes was not trying to build this new home starting from nothing, starting from scratch. But for example, I'm not sure what examples Descartes used, but it was something on the lines of I will trust the major authorities that influenced my lives as having taught me something meaningful, or something on these lines, I believe it was. Gadamer was making the more general point that without prejudice, you would be incapable of perception in the first place. Prejudice is also already expressed in the fact how you speak to people. The fact that when you meet a new person, this is not something that, the concrete example is not from Gadamer, this is a different example that I'm coming up with now. So when you meet a new person, the first thing you do is not nothing. Because if you were to be radically unprejudiced towards other people, you would have to basically assume nothing. That you wouldn't know how to greet them, you wouldn't know whether to look into their eyes, or whether or not to assume that looking in their eyes would actually offend them, because there are cultures where looking people intensely in the eyes is taken as an offense, as an act, as an attempt to dominate the other person. You would not know anything about that person that you could take for granted. So you wouldn't know whether the person doesn't want to be punched in the face the first time that you meet them. And yet you have a very, very clear and very relatively strict protocol of what you do when you meet a new person on the street, and or when you try to engage a person you have never talked to. You have a relatively universal today protocol of what things that you do and things that you don't know that you don't do. But technically, this is prejudice. You don't know for sure. You have not proven that in this given situation, this approach will be workable with this specific person. The person might be a black swan event. The person might be totally different from everybody else you've met. They might even be mindless. You wouldn't even know whether they're not a machine. even assuming that they're a human being who shares certain characteristics with you, already is a prejudice. It's something that you have not proven technically and with precision, where you undoubtedly know that yada yada yada. And Gadamer was making the point that without tradition, we would not be able to, as John Vervaeke puts it today, to relevance realize it all. In other words, whenever you're asking a scientific question, those scientific questions don't come out of the void. They are not the result of just pure speculation and pure randomness and just the result of having no prejudice at all. A different example that was used by, I think it was, I forgot his name, Chalmers, I think. Not the consciousness Chalmers, but the theory of science Chalmers guy. And he was making the point that, look, you would not know with certainty whether your shoe size might not be related to the size of the moon. This is, technically, we don't know, right? We don't have an absolute proof, and yet this is not a meaningful scientific question. How do you know? How do you distinguish the meaningful scientific questions from the meaningless scientific questions? And the reality of it is most of that is intuition. You have a sense for what works within this realm. You have a lot of prejudices that you take for granted of how reality you believe works at its foundation. And most of those you can't prove with precision, yet you take them for granted, and based on those assumptions about what we think we know about reality and physical reality in particular in this case, you then ask questions about nature that seem meaningful and it might get you further in your quest, because just raising questions is not something that will get you anywhere. You have to ask strategic questions, and this is true, I believe, for every science. You can't just randomly ask questions. This would be outright mindless, but you have to ask in a very concentrated way and in a very goal-oriented way questions. And the moment you're goal-oriented, you already are prejudiced, whether you like it or not. And the broader point that Gadamer was making is that what we experience as prejudice is actually the result of cultural learning, is actually the result of other generations, past generations having had experiences. And it is the result of the overall evolutionary process itself. So you experience it as something that is given to you, as something that you can't prove, as something where you don't really know where it comes from, the sense of intuition of where certain ideas, for example, or certain ways of doing things come from. And yet they are the result of a cultural learning process that itself is not bulletproof. It is a process which can fail. So it always makes sense, as Descartes did, to question, to put into brackets certain ideas and probe and see whether you cannot think differently about things. But at the same time, radical and absolute doubt is impossible. Radical and absolute doubt, where you try to question every single assumption that you have and everything that you otherwise take for granted, is not something that makes you more and super intelligent. It's something that makes you that makes you absolutely stupid, because you become incapable of perceiving, you become incapable of paying attention to anything anymore in life, and that's not a constructive position from which you can work. And the general point, as I understood it from Gadamer, is that if you take tradition as a general orientation, as a general starting point, as if you want a small cell from which to begin, as already an embodied sense of what is relevant to you by taking over the relevance horizon. I think this is something that I took from Charles Taylor. You have a horizon of relevance where things are standing in different distances towards you. And you feel certain things are closer to you than other things. And most of that horizon is not the result of conscious reflection. Most of it is taken over. And the moment basically you perceive, the moment in your personal development, the moment you have a sense of I am here and the world is out there, you already have a horizon. You already have a sense for which things are drawing you into them. So you want to reach out to them, you want to grab them, you want to touch them, you want to be close to them, and which things repel you. And this is the starting position. It's not a disembodied position where everything's just equal to you, but it is always an embodied perspective, as Taylor puts it, as a horizon of relevance, where you feel closer to certain things and certain things are drawing you into them. and you value them more than other things. And this is your starting position. It is not nothing. It's not it's not just flat. It's not a world where everything is equally valid and equally valuable. But it's a world which is like a sphere. It is a world which already has an extension. It is not it's not point-like. It's not like it has no extension at all. And yet, however, it's limited. It's a limited sphere of things that are relevant to you, of things that you pay attention to, that you strive for. And what you can do from this starting point, which is already embodied and already meaningful, is to expand it by asking questions, by probing into reality, by attempting new perspectives, by asking questions that meaningfully expand your horizon, and not by asking absolutist questions, which would supposedly introduce from a world which is absolutely meaningless to you, which is point-like, a world that is meaningful. This is not possible. You can't do that. You have to already start with a relatively meaningful world, with a relatively extended sphere, and attempt to grow bigger. You can't start out with nothing, with a radically disembodied perspective, and ask the question, what should I do? This is an unanswerable question. If the starting point is an absolutist perspective, in the sense that it's a position which is not connected to me, but it could be anybody else asking the question, and anybody else should receive the same answer. This is a generalized position, right? Where it's not me just asking the question starting from my sphere, but you take away your own sphere of experience, because supposedly it's prejudice, and ask from nowhere, what should all human beings do in a certain situation? You can never come up with a meaningful answer. You can never get to anything like resembling like a human meaningful life. And this is a typical feature of overdoing modernity, actually, trying to disembody yourself too much and ask from the perspective of nowhere, which oftentimes leads to the very, very well-known experience of depression, which is the sense of disconnectedness from yourself and the world, where you feel that feelings are not really worthy anymore, and feelings are not really a meaningful response to what you're doing in life, but feel disconnected from the reality surrounding you. You can't feel into the reality surrounding you, and you can't meaningfully respond even with your emotions. Your emotions are not anymore a meaningful guide and a meaningful response to what's happening to you in your personal life, but they seem detached, almost groundless and boundless, and oftentimes to the negative, where there is just absolutely no point in doing anything. And there is no point in doing anything when you start from this absolutist perspective. When you start from the perspective of embodied existence, everything is meaningful from the start, and even the existence of an animal, and in animals have a relatively small sphere of relevance. They don't care particularly much beyond their immediate surroundings and the immediate close connections they have with the relevant others surrounding them. They don't care particularly much about more than that, but this is already a sphere of meaning. This is already an embodied experience where you have an orientation, where you already have a horizon of relevance, which you can extend, again, by using questions and by looking into the world out there. But you can't just undo it, do away with it, and start from nothing and build from scratch an absolutely solid and unquestionable position. The result is not that you will get to truth, but the result is that you will get into depression, and you will get into meaninglessness, because everything will look predictable, everything will look understood, everything will look like you can make sense of it in some physicalist terms, for example. But that's not meaning. That's the exact opposite. The moment you feel reality is perfectly predictable, the moment you feel you can put it in categories and you feel like you've understood it, even though most of these explanations are really bad if you look at them in detail, but the moment you feel you have, in physicalist terms, explained reality, you actually lose meaning. You lose the grounding, and you lose the point of it all, which is really weird. This is something that it seems to me only human beings are capable of. I don't think animals have this specific problem of being able to radically undo their own experience and their own relevance horizon and end up in a point where they feel totally disconnected with everything that's happening to them. But we can do that. We're good enough to do that. And this is one of the major malaises of modernity. It's one of the major dangers of modernity, of ending up in a kind of brainy perspective, which attempts to build a life based on reflection and based on using categories to figure out how things are supposedly working in reality and trying to conform to those categories and to those basic patterns that we see out there in the world, which makes us less like a human, but makes us less look like a machine to others. And unfortunately, it doesn't feel that well once you start embodying it and once you break your own embodied perspective. And that's something that I took from Gadamer, and I think it's still valid today. The starting point, the embodied starting point, particularly the starting point which includes tradition and doesn't do away with everything that tradition so far has been doing, I think has its value, while always, of course, taking into account that just taking things over is not enough either. Just having a sphere of relevance is not going to do the job either. You have to extend the sphere by rubbing it against other spheres and touching into the world out there, which is indeed way bigger than our relevance horizon allows for. And it is way more complex than our relevance horizon allows for. And we can extend that. We can go from this relatively small sphere into something that is more encompassing and more inclusive, as Wilber puts it. It's something that includes more of the world surrounding us. But we can't start from a blank, if you want, slate and from a point-like position and have an absolute valid position built from there. What we'll build from there is pretty sure something that's not worth living, let alone dying for.